I'm going to start with reading just an excerpt from Rosa's District 6 and then the Writing Circle and a few pieces I have that elaborate on writing the relation. For those of you who don't know the meaning of my last name, Maart, which is in Dutch, and German, January, February, Maart, which is the third month of the year. And when the Dutch colonized South Africa, there are two streams or two theories regarding our last names. The one is we were named after, our last names were discarded and named after the month that we became slaves. And in my case, my grandfather's Maart, my grandmother, who's Indian, of Indian heritage, born in South Africa, is September, and my cousins are April. So you can imagine the glorious time we have when we get together. So Rosa's District 6, I'll just tell you a little bit. I grew up in Cape Town. I was born in District 6. We were removed from District 6 due to the Group Areas Act that was imposed and the Forced Removal Act, and we were removed on the 4th of August, which is now I think of as Obama's birthday. In 1973, when I was 11 and a half years old, I got hives every single year, big, thick, frothy hives on the same day, and I would just lie in bed, or nobody would disturb me or bother me. It's difficult in a house with so many children. And then in my 20s, when I first went to England, I got the hives again. And I went to Canada, I got the hives again on the same day. And you know how you have friends who you love but you don't like, who said, "For God's sake, Rozena, you do psychoanalysis, how can you not see this?" Because I grew up in a house where we could talk about everything, but for the sake of my grandmother and my grandfather, we never spoke about District 6. And so I wrote my first story when I was in Toronto, when I thought, how could these hives possibly follow me around the earth, to England, to Canada? And I wrote it as Rosa would have written it at the age of 8, coming from a background where, like District 6, where Cape Town, where English, Malay, Afrikaans and Xhosa is mixed into the vernacular without full stops or punctuation. Mummy and Mama always say that I make things up and that I have a lively imagination, and I'm like the people in the olden days. They just used to tell stories about other people before them. That's why Mummy and Mama always tear my papers up and throw it away. But it's not true. I never make things up. I always tell Mama what happened, and Mama don't believe me, and I tell Mummy, and Mummy don't believe me too. And then I write it on a piece of paper or on the wall behind Oscar building or in the sand or at the park. And Mr. Franks at school, he don't believe me too, because he says that I always make trouble with the teachers, and I talk too much, and I jump too much, and I laugh too much, and I don't sit still too much, and I always have bubblegum, and I have pieces of things and paper in my hair always come loose. And Mama told Mr. Franks that I went to the doctor because I get pulls, because I'm hyperactive, like Mama said, someone who's restless all the time. But Mr. Franks don't believe that I'm under the doctor because I make too much movements, and today Mr. Hansen gave me 4 cuts because he said that I was disobedient and that I caused trouble in the class. But it's not true, because you see, last week we celebrated Jan van Riebeck's Day on the 6th of April with the flag, and we sing Die Blauw van onze Hemel on the grass for the assembly. And 4 weeks ago, Mr. Hansen teached us Jan van Riebeck made Cape Town and built a fort and eradicated a halfway station for food and supplies for the Dutch people and the European people, so that they could rest at the Cape after a long journey. And then Mr. Hansen also told us that Van Riebeck's wife was Maria de la Coilerie. This is true, I didn't make this up. Mummy and Mummy always said that I make things up. And then Marie, the big girl in my class, she has the periods already. She told us she wondered why Maria put her cotton with blood on it in the ship from Holland, because Marie's mummy told her not to tell her daddy that her brother and her uncles about her periods, because men must never see or know these things. And then we all laughed because Marie's very funny, and today we had to give in our assignments on Van Riebeck. And Mr. Hansen gave me 4 cuts on my hand because I drew a picture of Maria and not Jan. And Mr. Hansen said that the assignment was about Jan van Riebeck and not Maria. And I say, it's the same thing because it's part of the same history lesson. And Mr. Hansen screamed at me to shut up, and his veins were standing out, and he said that I wasn't paying attention and that he's going to write another letter to Mummy about my behavior. And I asked Mr. Hansen if Maria and Jan had children. And Mr. Hansen said that I want to play housey-housey all the time and not learn history. I said that if Maria was Jan's wife, then maybe they had children. And then Mr. Hansen took me down to the office to Mr. Franks, because Mr. Franks is the principal, and Mr. Hansen told Mr. Franks that I was causing trouble. And Mr. Franks believed Mr. Hansen and tells him that I should not have been in school in the first place, because I made too much trouble since sub A, because when I was 5, Mr. Henson said that I should go home because I should be 6, and Mr. Frank sent me home, and the next day Mummy went to school and made a big performance, and Mr. Frank took me back because Mama don't want to look after me the whole day because I started to write when I was 4, and Mama said, I made too much mess on the walls and on the things, and now the school don't want me back no more. Mr. Frank said that I must bring Mummy to school, but I didn't do anything wrong because all I wanted to know was if Maria and Jan had children. That's all. So Rosa decides that she wasn't going to school because she hasn't told her family yet that she's been kicked out at the age of 5. So she got expelled. And so I'm skipping a bit, just to give you a bit of the story. So she decides to hide in one of the houses in the neighborhood because people didn't lock their doors. So she's lying basically under the bed, and she hears the 2 women in her neighborhood. She thought they were related. And the one woman is called Flowers, Auntie Flowers, and the other one is called Mrs. Hood. Rosa watched carefully as Mrs. Hood brought the metal bath into the bathroom. Mrs. Hood moved towards Auntie Flowers and stroked her hair. It was not so unusual for Rosa to see Mrs. Hood plant a kiss on Auntie Flowers' cheeks. The kiss was long and wanting. Auntie Flowers was still singing. Wait till the birds are singing. Wait till my heart is ringing. Flowers, give your hand with the water, please, Mrs. Hood said. Wait for the morning sun. Wait till the birds are done. Auntie Flowers wrapped a towel around her hands and assisted Mrs. Hood with a pot of hot water from the coal stove. As Rosa waited for them to enter the room, she was aware of something moving on her head. Rosa, for fear of missing out on the bathing, took her head sideways until a small spider fell to the ground. It was a small spider. Its presence distracted her immensely. Auntie Flowers hated spiders, and seeing one now would cause for her to run out of the house and for Mrs. Hood to go running after this harmless creature, only to find yet another under her bed, a more dangerous 8-year-old creature between her overdue urinal and her husband's military boots. Rosa grabbed the spider and tossed it into the urinal. It died instantly. The 2 women had brought the big cast iron bath into the room. Mrs. Hood kept pouring cold water into the bath. Rosa, in the meanwhile, found a pair of Uncle Tucky's shoes and placed them over the urinal to block the smell. Auntie Flowers went into the backyard and came back with some lavender violets and yellow daisies. She gently removed the petals and threw them into the water. Although its floating glory was not visible to Rosa, the child smiled a pleasant smile, thinking that Auntie Flowers was finally going to announce the name of her love and ask as female children do. He loves me, yes. He loves me, no. He loves me, yes. And at the pluck of the last petal, accompanying the positive answer with a scream of joy. Instead, Auntie Flowers placed the last petal on Mrs. Hood's head. The woman exhaled deep from within her bosom and blew the petal until it floated on the air, coming to rest on her dress. Rosa watched attentively as Mrs. Hood undressed. Her dress was the first garment she lifted over her head. It fell softly to her feet. As Mrs. Hood bent to pick it up, Rosa saw that Mrs. Hood's kadumachi was showing. Unlike Rosa's, which was tied to her vest, Mrs. Hood's was tied to her bosom. Her breasts were large and full and held her petticoat firmly. Mrs. Hood removed her arms from the garment. She slipped it off her shoulders and wiggled around with both her hands between her legs. Without much ado, the full contents of Mrs. Hood's underwear were removed, and Rosa's mouth gaped opened at her nakedness. It was Mrs. Hood's belly that fascinated Rosa most. It was similar to Uncle Tommy's. He had scars of war, physical fight, operations, and many other journeys he'd been on. Rosa thought about her geography lesson and how Mrs. Hood's stomach resembled a map, with mountains and all. Mama Zilla's flesh was firm for her 60 years, and she had no scars of any sort. And like Mama Zilla, Mrs. Hood had not cupped her breasts either. It was their resistance to white settler colonial culture and the need to remain untainted by it, which was not observable or understood by the 8-year-old female child, since she had rubbed her breast with onions, a local remedy, with the hope that hers would soon fit a commoditized pre-packaged cotton cup. Mrs. Hood's breasts were darker, and clustered around her nipples lay large, orally celebrated protrusions. Mrs. Hood's breast hung flat against her belly, and her warm fingertips gently soothed the clustered skin until the fullness of her nipple was visible to Auntie Flowers. It looked warm and comforting. Rosa was moving her hands around, thinking about the long extensions of breast and how it reminded her of her winter gloves, the ones she wore during July and August when her hands were sore and stiff. Auntie Flowers also unbuttoned her dress, and the two women faced one another naked, each with their own shape. They stepped into the bath together, Auntie Flowers embracing Mrs. Hood from behind. Splashes of water fell to the floor, and small lavender petals stuck to the outside of the bath. The two women remained locked in their embrace for quite a while, their silence perturbing Rosa greatly. Mrs. Hood placed her head gently on Auntie Flowers' shoulder. Her long grey hair made big circles on the nape of her neck, sculpturing her clavicles in a somewhat vivacious manner. The room was silent. Both women were breathing deeply. The release of their breath shook the room. They both breathed out repeatedly. It was not like the voice lesson Mrs. Jacobs gave, Rosa thought. This was very different. Auntie Flowers broke the embrace, removing Mrs. Hood's arms and hands. She stroked them rhythmically, like the foot throw does with babies. Auntie Flowers hummed a song. It was familiar to Rosa. She had her eyes fixed on Auntie Flowers' knees, which were round and big like Mama Zilla's, and told Rosa that it was Auntie Flowers who did the scrubbing and polishing of floors in the house. Auntie Flowers stroked Mrs. Hood's hair and made rings with it, sprinkling water on the curly strands. Some of the droplets nestled onto Mrs. Hood's lips. The two women placed their fingers in each other's mouth. Rosa found it exciting to see grown women exchange spit. She wondered whether they did the same with food. Although this was an exchange of water, Rosa thought of it equally defiant. Mama Zilla had warned Rosa so many times about exchanging food already chewed, and Rosa thought about telling Mama Zilla about the incident. The thought left her mind immediately as the two women exchanged places in the bathtub. They sat facing one another, and Rosa could only see Mrs. Hood's back and some parts of Auntie Flowers. It was the way in which Auntie Flowers cupped her hands and poured water over Mrs. Hood's breast that fascinated Rosa most. It reminded Rosa of Father John in baptism at St. Mark's, where the family attended church. Auntie Flowers did utter a few words, silent words, warm words, judging by the serene smile on Mrs. Hood's face. Although not exactly in the same tone as Father John, both women's eyes were cast upwards at the ceiling. Rosa wondered if they were talking to God. The women embraced one another tighter. Water squirted out between their legs, and the overflow ran behind the bed to meet the unwelcome gaze of Rosa's shoes, both of which were still stuck in her bosom. Suddenly, like a stroke of lightning, Mrs. Hood raised herself. Rosa closed her eyes for fear of what was going to happen to her. With her eyes closed and waiting for her punishment, Rosa heard Mrs. Hood grab something and ruffle its contents. A ray of sunlight shone on the side of Rosa's face. The sun, although not casting its full power, had enticed Mrs. Hood towards the greater acceptance of its rays. Boldly she drew the curtains, wrapped them around her wet legs, and danced a childlike dance, a tantalizing, somewhat naughty, teasing motion that enhanced the sharpness of her clavicles. Its wetness was bronze like a medal, waiting patiently to be touched and admired. Mrs. Hood's teeth met the temptation, sucking dearly at its warmth until blood filled the gaps between her teeth. Her kiss planted a red glowing print on Auntie Flowers' face, and the woman's sparkling eyes made Dracula seem like a hopeless case for seduction against the wishes of frightened, chaste women. Both women ate graciously from the blood, their tongues curling with lust and their palates seeping with nutritious contents. There was passion, love, admiration, an exchange of caring moments stolen from the heavy load which the constraints of marriage bore. No body or blood of Jesus Christ could fulfill the spirituality of body, of being that these two women felt and allowed themselves to indulge in. As the blood coloured the water, Auntie Flowers scooped a handful and poured it over her face. Rosa's tilted face and opened mouth allowed for the sun to shine on her palate. Gulping the air from these two love-drunk women, breathed, Rose's eyes were still, her body lay motionless, and like a mother feeds a child, Mrs. Hood lifted her breast from the waist up, holding onto their length with her knees whilst Auntie Flower's mouth enveloped the quivering protrusion. Heavy breathing, like a voice lesson, Rosa thought again, was the medium through which these two women communicated their desire. It's not finished, I'm just going to stop there for this moment. When I wrote the story, it was shortly after I had had now the last of those hives, which was in 1990. This story, because the first 3 pages were written in a kind of Cape Town, some people say patois, I say vernacular. I didn't think anything of it. One of my friends came, it was more therapeutic means for me, and borrowed my apartment. She worked for a literary journal, and while I was helping her set up to do her work, she saw it and begged me to give it to her, and 2 years later it won the Journey Prize for Best Short Fiction in Canada. And I had no idea that something that wasn't written in what is supposedly standard English would even be considered. It was a blind jury, but I also firmly believe that spoken words and written words has to come from a subject who speaks it in the way without compromises. And that's still the way that I write today. From District 6, we were moved to Lavender Hill, and it was very, very difficult to be in a place that was created basically for the overflow of places like District 6, like Harfield, like Sophia Town in the Johannesburg region, that was basically created as small little ghettos for people to move in. So it took me a long time to be able to write about that area that I grew up in. I'm going to read a small portion just about Cape Town, if anybody has been to Cape Town. And I encourage you, if you do visit South Africa, make sure that people don't only take you around to the tourist parts of the city, that you go to Lavender Hill and Steenberg and Cork Bay and get to know the population and spend time as a visitor, not as a tourist. Cape Town, Sun, Sea, Table Mountain, Rugby, Robben Island, Mandela. First they are words evoked, provoked, then images, and each, when uttered by those who know the city that sits at the tip of Africa, see it, feel it, murmur it, a lingering sound laced with pleasure, then one long, drawn-out, luxurious sigh. Ah! There you can smell the air as you inhale after sounding your exhalation. Those from outside of the African continent have heard of Cape Town, through newspaper accounts and televised news bulletins. Many of the occasional documentary still produce images of 1976. Soweto, times of protest, with young people in marches, scattered by bullets and tear gas, the courtesy of policemen in stiff blue uniforms armed to kill. Some hosing down the defiant demonstrators, determined that the water will quench our thirst for freedom. The poster of the distraught young man running with the body of Hector Peterson in his arms, his gaping mouth quivering with horror, and the bold young woman beside him running for her life, his, theirs, everyone's, is still displayed on walls in the homes of those who will never forget the day, and those who live encased in white walls known for exhibiting just a hint of conscience. The contents of these images faded for many after the first democratic elections took place in 1994. The posters with young people, fists held high, mouths to match, chanting the Amandla salute between rubber bullets and tear gas, were removed and slowly replaced by ones showing voters, meandering through the dusty roads in villages, the forgotten dorp, towns with names one does not easily recall, each location determined to exercise the previously unattainable act of voting for a democracy. On the walls of bedrooms shared by teenagers, posters of Beyoncé and Zinedine Zidane face their beds. These are the faces that appear on the walls of teenagers. These are their dreams. For Capetonians who live at the sea, under the sun, who voted for Mandela and saw Robben Island transform into a museum, with ferries making the trip to and from the island to the Cape Town dockyard each day, it is the Cape Flats. The Cape Flats where the warm, moist breath of life is exhaled from the mouths of people who live several hundred feet away from Table Mountain and who flower above the land and sea. A land petaled by chocolate-faced people who look like me. Sweet by name, sweet by nature. for blossom because we were never expected to. The Cape Flats, the colourful Cape Flats, with its chock and block taxis, vendors selling fruit and veg on street corners, embellishing bell peppers, glorifying grapes, children running across the road without a robot to guide them, women chattering along to work, monthly train tickets covered in thick protective see-through plastic pouches, dangling from closely held sling bags, walking arm in arm like coconut clusters held together by cinnamon legs and sugary conversation, patting their head down into submission like good little pets asked to behave in misty weather, then fingering their lips with a lipstick. The best friend just offered. A grandfather who announced he was dying almost 20 years ago, but whose life was prolonged by the pleasure of licking Rizzlers, the thin white paper he rolls his tobacco in frail arthritic fingers, a thick tongue lined by lies and treachery, living past the expected age of someone with his lungs, out of spite, refusing to give up his place at the head of the crooked kitchen table, as his sons and daughters look on, tired of the charades he performs at the end of the month when pickled with liquor and laughter. Courtesy of the government pension he collects, which he claims he will never outlive him. Pay back time, my dear, he says, for participation in the Second World War, for which he got no recognition, except for the bicycle, which still hangs above his side of the bed. A disgruntled wife who caresses the beads to her rosary as she recites her prayers and asks God to grant her the possibility of an early widowhood. The television set which remains on at all hours these days as an alibi, a witness to the kinds of lives people on the Cape Flats lead, and a reminder of the ones our imaginations are navigated towards. Children who refer to anyone over the age of 18 as auntie and uncle, and the older generation who does the same to those older than they are, as a sign of respect. Plastic bottles filled with tea hanging from infantile lips, sugared to the Cape Flats condition. The promise of diabetes pumping through their veins. The shape of the nippled rubbery pacifier known as a dummy to most, suggestive of the muted, passive state it is meant to install, but never accomplishes while engraving its brown, sugary mark upon young enamel, destined for extraction. This is the Cape Flats, the colourful, crowded, cluttered, conversational, energetic, friendly, fiery, hectic piece of peninsula people at the Cape call home. That's where I moved to. When I was asked to do this particular talk, I chose 6 small pieces because I think I'm going to skip something just so that we have quite a bit of time for people who have comments or questions and for discussion. And so, writing the relation has 6 components in this particular segment. The child who writes in English. The white page is given to her as a child in school by a teacher who wishes to see presents engraved on it. Yours, hers, that which she has understood as the written, the order of her white imaginary. And there in the moist air of the southern sun, perfumed by proteas, laughter, and peanut butter sandwiches, the girl's hand curves across the page as the teacher watches. Her eyes widen, her thin lips curl inward toward the thorns of her instruction. Her body stiffens. The embrace of the white, tense, middle-class moment. Her breath held in order to complete her colonial composure. Thinking loudly, she exhales with no words, only to tell the child she has no order. No order, no obedience, no authority to inflict such insubordination. The young girl writes. Writing melts out of her moist hands onto cold pages, stricken with narrow passages, lined to compress her thoughts and force a path of reading before the word is written. Lines that limit, closing, narrowing the passages await her. Blocked on both sides, above and beneath, the young girl writes. From left to right, but only to be instructed by the rules of the language, whose civilization she has to uphold in order to write it, use it, speak it, perform it on the page that is given. The page aching for rebellion, the page that is not free, bleached, whitened, stiffly formatted, to keep black out. Blue ink, the royal blood with which the colonial word is inscribed, while the words of the colonized refuses to beg, but bounces along the walls until it finds its roots and spreads, like butter begging for bread, soaked in history, to be shared in the communion of those for whom the written word is always the breath of life, sucked through a straw, kissed in the mouth, and blown out like bubbles to be dispersed everywhere. This one is called Imagination. Imagination changes everything. A blue sky so openly awaited them as they sailed into the southern shores. Beneath it, they met prosperity and called her by her first name. A vast land, a sea that frothed at the mouth, a copulation imagined from north to south. In dreams where fish fly and dragons spit gold, darkness answers to the rape of the land, like a thief bearing gifts to those whose souls he swallowed. Imagination laughs louder than crashing waves as they hiss lively to shores where ghosts wander and bring them home to kitchen tables for bread and butter on days when the outside chatter reminds children of who have come before. Aunties and uncles gesels in the street, children greeting children with wide smiles and big eyes, and in that moment, when they recognize the child who tells stories larger than the size of a tin foil shack, they wear the look of imagination gone wild, for the child has learned to imagine the impossible when possibility was castrated at the root, but grew in her pockets when she clutched defiance between her sweetened fingers and took the gift her grandmother left with both arms and legs and spread it across her dark face so that her eyes could bear the light that no white man could erase. This one is called The Space. The space between her legs and his, the distance that measures lust, salivates at the proposal of pleasure. You are mine, here and now. In the moment when blissful ignorance arouses nature's unspoiled beast. That is what you said of native girls who refused your advances, those whose name you remembered by the shape of their pussies, those you took and held in the palm of your hand, those whose whispers never made it home, those you wrote of in your ink that lie hidden in pages licked and stamped, then posted to the mother country, your perfect postcard with the native's nipple and navel in the retina of your hungry eye. They are sweet here, you said. Here where space is everywhere and the smell of diamonds hang like vapor on your vampire's breath. You sank your teeth in our necks and sailed your ships to our shores and spread our blood across the African floor. The spaces between his legs and his, between bodies twirled in forbidden pleasure, manly treasures faint of heart, the space between his teeth carries the aftermath of his lover's breath. Between spaces where bodies stand, where blood runs, where fingers trace, the forbidden murmurs of words intended for those whose ears were buried behind tormented hands. Writing stares in slender repose. Blood bleeds into ink from the corpses gathered together to pay homage to unspoken words. They are pauses longer than the absence of laughter, spaces left for words to fill when horror shows its rotten teeth. And then there are spaces created by you and me, doors we kicked down, windows we have broken, classroom doors we've smacked to the ground, to let in the ghetto and the concentration camp, the barrio, the nature reserve, and the township, so that the space where the struggle for freedom orgasms flows into the sea of liberated desires. This one is called Another White Mythology. I've often encountered people, because I write about rape and sexual assault, whose only interest is in whether black women and coloured women who look like me were raped or our grandparents were raped. It's become a little obsession. Rose petals between her legs, her tongue lingers down the slippery slope of his white thighs, only to find that truth hides its faces between bedsheets soaked in forbidden pleasure. Rape is often the cry of the blinded historian who only sees black women forced by white men against our wishes, for we have no will, they seem to say. We are the roots of causes bound between caged pages, inked with slanted tales, of only one thought, one idea, one cunt, one purpose, to be fucked against our will, in the name of the colony, for which the rape of flesh is worth its weight in theory. For only when black women emerge as raped and mutilated do we emerge as subjects of post-colonial texts, colonized by the myth of the academic's white mythology. This one is called We Come to Consciousness. It's just one more after this. We come to consciousness out of disappointment, betrayal, the stabbing of words curdled by sour milk and cold blood. We come to consciousness in the bitter aftertaste of icy realization that what was never were. Consciousness never comes as a gift, as beautiful as legs that parcel flesh and cross like a bow. Consciousness thrusts itself into the flesh, stabbing at memories buried in unsifted soil, cased in open coffins whose faces are ours of 1,000 years. We come to consciousness when we are forced to think of who we are. A word, a phrase, a look, a murmur forces us to listen here, there, now, everywhere, stumbling from table to chair, groping words by the neck, wringing it, until drops of ink lie motionless under tables lame with shame, refusing to be lifted to pages where promises of prosperity await. We come to consciousness when we can't lift our heads from pillows dressed in sorrow, praying for tomorrow because today wants to run away, with our heads on the plate and our heart in its hand. We come to consciousness when nothing else matters than the thought that something more important will restore meaning to our lives, when meaning as we know it does not want us in it. We come to consciousness when the old confronts the new, when the thought of something new reminds us that our minds matter more than the matter itself. For through our mind, the matter is rolled out on a new wooden board and takes the shape which the yeast allows for it to grow. We come to consciousness in the still of the night, when fear loses itself, in the moment between freedom or death, and freedom frolics around a candle whose flame gets another name. And before we blow out the new light, we come to see that the only light we hold is never written in bold. It feeds itself of the restless stirring in our bellies, because it is born of the marriage between despair and sorrow, whose child is called memory, who whispers your name and asks that you breathe a new breath into the earth when you wake up each day with the joy that consciousness has found you when you believed it would never go out of its way. I just want to read one more. Okay. I'm going to read one more, but I thought just before I get to that, I'll read this. I've often been asked, because I grew up in a very overcrowded house, when I experienced my first taste of freedom. And this is usually, in a nutshell, what I say. Born in overcrowded slave quarters, freedom comes to the black woman who finds a solitary spot to undress and feel her flesh, who swallows the sun while she pleasures herself and enjoys the estuaries of a liberated cunt. This is the last one, it's called forgiveness. I'm often asked about forgiveness. I even got asked about forgiveness and reconciliation during my job interview. Forgiveness, the word of the decade past and present, smells like roses from a fresh grave, smells like fear when I am near. Squeezing demons through a sieve to make white wine, to toast new beginnings, when the old warm red won the gold for its marathon of cruelty. A dinner table is set for celebration, sirs and servants that bring silence and song, attended by maids a cook and madams who coordinate colonial comforts. We called it our struggle, you called it your right. We come to writing when words sound harder than rock, and their sounds pound their way into pencil of knuckled hands, whose raised fists once knew the only word which could not be found in the dictionary, amandla. We come to forgiveness in torn lips, sewn together by clenched teeth. We come to forgiveness in memories overflowing on riverbanks, stroking the bones of skeletons whose names will not be forgotten. We come to forgiveness when the sun draws its rays from our backs and shines it on the Christian cross, because forgiveness is the possession of those who colonized in the name of God to supplement their lack, for which there is only one response. I will not spend my time to consider your plea, your eyes that beg for me to see you in me. I will not offer you my thoughts or my ancestral smile. I will give you nothing and the grace of everything. I have learned to defy you, because the grace of everything is the nothing you once thought I had. So that's it.